Well, I'm going to wade into the controversial territory. Right now, the amount of medical care that the U.S. can provide is limited by the number of trained healthcare professionals who can do that care. What if that constraint went away? What if everyone had a doctor in their pocket?
Welcome to the Heart of Healthcare podcast. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Heart of Healthcare podcast. I'm your host, Hallie Tecco, and today I'm talking to not one, but two partners from Y Combinator, or YC, as it's better known. Jared Friedman has been a partner at YC for nearly a decade. He previously founded and was CTO at Scribd, which was funded by YC in 2006, which must have been one of the first classes at YC, right?
It was.
The first class?
The third class.
The third class. Amazing. And also Ankit Gupta, who's a visiting partner at YC and previously was head of AI at Ginkgo Bioworks, CTO at Reverie Labs, which was acquired by Ginkgo Bioworks, and a machine learning head teaching fellow at Harvard. Ankit, Jared, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
We have so much to cover today, but let's just start out with a topic that, Jared, I've heard you talk a lot about, which is hard tech. You guys both come to investing and working with startups from technical positions, specifically at startups. And hard tech is an area that you're both really passionate about. First off, for our listeners, can you just define hard tech?
That's a good question. I don't know.
And is it the same as deep tech? That's my other question.
Yes, I've used the synonyms. I've always used the terms as synonyms. I can't distinctly recall hearing a very clear definition from anyone. So you're forcing me to think about what a really clear definition would be. Do you have one? Otherwise, I'll try to make up one on the fly.
Yeah, I'll have to think a tiny bit about that, actually.
Okay.
Well, I can't believe I'm already
you know it when you
guys.
See it. There's some that are very
Yeah,
obvious.
indeed.
There's a big gray area, right? I mean, obviously, a supersonic jet is hard tech. But what's the gray area in between?
Okay, well, I guess we should really be asking ChatGPT whether anyone has come up with a really precise, cogent definition. But if you force me to do it without cheating, I would say it is a company where the amount of technical risk in succeeding greatly outweighs the amount of market risk. Like, and to sort of explain that, a framework that I often tell founders is that most companies have primarily two forms of risk. They have technical risk, which is, can you build the product? And then they have market risk, which is, assuming you can build the product, do people want to buy it? Most like traditional startups that you would think of, like software companies, B2B SaaS or whatever, basically pure market risk, right? Like there's no mystery in building a B2B SaaS website. It's a totally solved problem. The question is whether anybody needs the particular B2B SaaS website that you propose to build, right? Versus, like what Ankit built, which is like AI drug discovery, is exactly the opposite. There's no question that patients want drugs that cure diseases. The question is whether you can make them.
I would actually say all of healthcare has tremendous market risk, and probably some of healthcare has some product risk. But then there's a third one I'm curious that you didn't mention, which is like execution risk, and thinking about, are the people who are coming to this problem the right people to solve the problem?
Yeah, I suppose in practice, execution risk tends to be very closely tied to technical and market risk. At least I don't necessarily think about your ability. I don't necessarily think about what you are making as independent of who is making it, right? The way things are made are always a function of who is making them, and the ways they are sold to someone is a function of who is selling them. And I would bet that there were other people who may have considered making your home be a place that others could live in on a marketplace, but may not have approached it the same way Brian Chesky did to start Airbnb. And I think there's a very sort of tight overlap between, or it's sort of an interleaving thing of how you actually execute and whether a market exists for something and whether it can be built.
So when we think about hard tech within healthcare, are you thinking mostly on the biotech side, device side, AI? Like, what are some of the hard tech opportunities in healthcare? What do they look like?
What do you think, Ankit?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of a few here. So I think that a big part of what I think will open up a lot of opportunity in healthcare and in biotech is to think about where the biggest bottlenecks are. So in the context of biotech, actually, probably the biggest bottlenecks that I can see are in translatability from cells to animals and animals to humans, and in actually executing things in the lab, right? So being able to actually do experiments at a scale that you can generate large data sets to do interesting scientific discoveries with. And both of those are basically hard tech problems. Like the first of those is a technical problem of can you make cellular and then animal systems that replicate real human physiology? And then the second one is probably a robotics problem of can you build great multi-purpose general robotics that can do lab experiments really effectively? And so in the context of biology, I think actually a lot of the biggest unlocks that would be enabled in this next generation of companies probably comes from thinking about things from this sort of hard tech perspective. In healthcare, yeah, I think a lot of the biggest opportunities are probably AI problems where it is probably less of a we need to make a fundamental scientific discovery to do something, and more about we have to understand a really convoluted process and be able to represent that in software. And I think AI enables us to represent that in software in a very different way from before, right? Before it was, let's sit down and perfectly design an interface that exactly represents what two parties want. And now it's more like, let's basically observe a set of interactions that two parties are doing and see if we can represent those in an AI system. And actually, AI is really good at doing that. And so I think it's sort of a new way we can think about building healthcare companies that wasn't really possible 5 years ago.
And when you think about the opportunities within hard tech and what AI enables, do you think that it's important that people have a healthcare background, that have a tech background? Like what sort of background enables founders to succeed in working on these really hard problems?
I think it's actually an amazing example of this, an amazing case study in this very question. Do you want to talk about your background and your co-founder's background and how you guys ended up building an AI for drug discovery company?
Yeah, we had sort of a weird background here. You know, on paper, we're computer scientists. We went to school and studied computer science. We were studying machine learning, and we were in ML research labs. Like you mentioned, I was teaching classes in machine learning, this kind of thing. Both of us had a rather deep obsession with healthcare and biology due to a mix of factors. Some of them were just sort of random factors. Many of our friends in college happened to be biologists. My wife is a doctor. And because of that, we were often thinking about problems in biology and healthcare. And then on top of that, we found the kind of impact opportunity there really massive. And so we were often drawn to that space as, you know, an area of impact. And then finally, the computer science problems in biology, I think, were some of the most interesting, where you're dealing with all these things that are not weird, contrived problems like you might see in a textbook. They were very real, like dealing with noisy data and messy distributions, and EHR representations and whatever are very much real problems when you're doing work in biology and healthcare. And so maybe there's a couple of interesting elements of that I think I often see in founders I really like working with, and maybe Jared has more examples of this. You know, one is that often there is an element of obsession about a space that is a really big factor in people who do work in some of these, you know, outside of the normal software thing companies where, yeah, maybe I didn't have a ton of expertise in biotech. Perhaps if I had a ton of expertise, that would have helped me in the early days, especially, and making fewer bad choices. But on the other hand, having an outsider's perspective allows you to kind of rebuild things from first principles. And if you have enough obsession about it, you know, you can actually build quite a lot of understanding about a space really fast. And then the second is around just having kind of a network of people. You know, I think having people in those worlds that we could go to and really lean on and, you know, have them come over to our house for dinner and then talk to them about their jobs for 5 hours ends up being a really effective way to understand quite a lot of depth very fast. Obviously, again, if I worked in that space, sure, even more depth, but often working in a space can give you a sort of extremely deep view into one narrow part of it and kind of put blinders on other parts as well. So there's a bit of a balancing act between kind of expertise and an outsider's perspective that I think can be a really healthy thing for a founder
it teaches you about how things have worked up to today and not necessarily how things could look in the future. Whereas you're coming at it with kind of fresh, new eyes. You kind of see all the possibilities. You're not held back by the legacy infrastructure. So YC founders have always skewed young. I think a lot of college grads, especially, in Silicon Valley, are a big portion of the founders that you guys work with. Is this because YC prefers younger founders? Is there something about younger founders that are more likely to succeed within your model? Or is it self-selection where, older founders might not feel like they need this sort of YC experience? Or do you think it's a combination of both?
Yeah, it's primarily the latter. Like, YC was originally designed to help founders who are technical learn business. You can think about it like a 3-month accelerated MBA program, or a 3-month accelerated version of like becoming an executive in the healthcare industry and learning about the healthcare business, by having an operating role. And so from the very beginning, sort of the target audience was people who had sort of exactly the background of like Ankit and his co-founder, which is they're like highly technical computer science people who are really interested in ML, really interested in healthcare, but like don't have a lot of industry experience or experience in the actual business of it. We wanted to give them an accelerated path to get a startup in that area off the ground. And
that makes sense.
Folks often ask us, what is our thesis around healthcare or a thesis around biotech? And they're expecting us to say something like, we think AI is going to, transform healthcare, which of course we do, but that's not our thesis. That's not why we're doing this. That's everyone's thesis, right? Like what I would say YC's unique and perhaps contrarian thesis in both healthcare and biotech is that we believe that some surprisingly young technical founders will be astonishingly successful when they start companies in these areas.
And you guys, YC has been dabbling in healthcare for quite a while now. I'd love to hear kind of what that thesis is and how YC's approach to healthcare has changed over the years. You guys have had wildly successful companies, and you've had companies that, have blown up, like Ubiome. So I'm curious, what are kind of these key lessons that you've learned that have changed your approach to investing in healthcare?
I don't actually know that the approach has changed at all.
What's the approach?
Fund smart, technical founders who are extremely motivated to work on hard problems.
And so the problem, you're open to whatever problem it is that they bring you. You're saying, I'm not going to be prescriptive about what within healthcare you're working on. We're just looking for folks that are smart, motivated to tackle these things.
Exactly.
And failure is just like part of it's just part of the cost.
100%.
I mean, most startups fail anyways.
Exactly.
But what about failures that I don't want to talk too much about Ubiome, but I think that's an interesting example because it is one where there was like a blast radius and there was, an investigation, and they're now FBI fugitives on the run. So I'm curious, like for those, like there has to be, I don't know, I don't think you've had that experience in other industries, but it happened, this one time in healthcare, and that would be enough for other investors to be like, oh shit, healthcare is like highly regulated. I'm not a healthcare expert, so I can't do it. But you guys have only doubled down on healthcare and backing good founders. So I'm curious, like how that experience, like, was it ever discussed internally? Like, oh, this, because look, Jessica looked amazing on paper. She had, there were no early red flags, I imagine. So I don't know what the postmortem looked like, but curious how that played out internally.
Part of this story that's relevant to healthcare is not that it's more regulated, but that it's mistakes are more important. Like healthcare companies have real responsibility. They're in the limit, they're responsible for people's lives, right? And that's a very sort of sacred responsibility. And whenever we fund companies at YC, one of the other criteria that we look for is, do we think these founders are good people? Do we think that they're going to behave responsibly and ethically if they get into the fortunate position that they are running a large and important company? And it's super important for us because Y Combinator is not just an investor. Y Combinator is a community. of founders. And letting bad eggs into that community is really bad for everyone, including YC. And so I would argue that much more than other investors who don't have this sort of like long-term community that they're nurturing and shepherding over time, we've been very careful to try not to fund people who are going to be bad eggs in the community, regardless of how, successful we think their company is going to be. And now, obviously, in Ubime's case, we made a mistake, and our character reading was off. But there are a number of other cases that I can't really publicly discuss where there are healthcare companies that apply to YC that ultimately became huge scandals that we decided not to accept, despite believing that the founders were smart and technical and ambitious and likely to be successful, because we just didn't trust them. We weren't convinced that these people were going to be ethical, responsible people, and we knew that they were going to run a high-profile, important business, and we just didn't want to. You don't
want to touch it.
Yeah.
It's interesting though, because in the early stages you have less data to go upon, like a series fee of growth. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you've noted. I mean, like
it's like your spidey sense.
To be clear, all the things that Ubime got in trouble for, they did like 5+ years after YC invested. So there's, without a time machine, there's no way that we could have, done due diligence or something right. And so the only thing that we can go on is the judgment of our best judgment of the character of the founders, which is very hard to do, but we try our best.
Yeah, I mean, and good people make. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, one thing I'll say is I think one of the most striking things about the YC community has been that, as you get to know these founders and as they grow their companies into sometimes just enormous mega corporations, these are some of the people who are running some of the most successful companies of the last few decades. Almost everyone I've interacted with is actually just like a very reasonable, nice person. It's actually kind of surprising. Like, in a sense, it's what's one of the most surprising aspects of this community, that, you interact with someone who's running a company worth $20 billion. And if you run into them in the street, they don't think that they're God, and they're very happy to help you out, and they'll pay it forward just like someone paid it forward to them. And I think those community elements actually are really important to us. I think it's a big part of what has made the successes work, and, sometimes make the failures not work.
Does that help? Okay, so one of the things that I think went wrong at Ubime and I think this is the reason a lot of companies go wrong, is they're good people who end up in situations where they have taken a lot of venture funding, they have tremendous pressure from their investors to grow at all costs, and they become willing after being worn down. They become more willing to cut corners. And is there anything about a community that can help you withstand that? Like, do you guys talk about these things, especially in sensitive areas like healthcare? We were like, okay, how are we all going to face like when things get tough and our investors are really pushing for top line growth? How do we explain to them that healthcare is slow?
And do you have any stories, Ankit, of how the YC founder community helped you guys at Forevery?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest things is just the availability of founders who are always a few years ahead of you in whatever you're dealing with, right? I think one of the most amazing things about YC is we have this sort of internal community of all of our founders, and you will see people in this community regularly reading forum posts and posting who are running really successful companies and are extremely busy people. And one of the most amazing things for me was, putting aside the exact experiences that led to some of these, but in some of the really tough times we faced, whether that was in a tough hire or a complicated interaction with an investor or a complicated business deal we might have been trying to do, there was always someone who I knew I could reach out to, and I could find their email, and with very high probability, they would reply within like an hour and get back to me and get on the phone and be able to have a conversation with me, because almost certainly they had dealt with something very similar in the last 2 or 3 years, and a similar YC founder had helped them on a circumstance like that a couple years earlier. And so I think that was one of the most helpful parts. I'm not actually sure that in that case, the healthcare specificity of it is actually the most critical thing. There are certain things we deal with that are very specific to healthcare. If you're selling to a particular organization or something, like, sure, totally. But I think a lot of what you face in terms of a strange investor dynamic or within team dynamic especially, a lot of those are universal across all companies. And I think one of the things that's maybe the most salient part is, at YC, we have this concept of group office hours. So it's a sort of group of 8 or so companies that you meet with every other week during YC. Yeah, it's kind of it can be kind of a group therapy, but it can also be people's lifelong friends. Probably of the 10 to 15 founders who are founder companies who are my closest kind of peer companies, I think 8 of them or 6 of them are ones from my group office hours. They're the ones who I've followed over the last, 8 years and who I chat with and text regularly and who I seek advice from, even though we've all sort of taken divergent paths over the years. And I think that community becomes very lifelong and very valuable.
Let's switch gears. I do want to talk about AI in healthcare. I'm curious some of the common pitfalls that you see in founders who are trying to bring AI to different healthcare problems.
Instead of talking about the pitfalls, can we talk about the opportunities?
Let's talk about the opportunities. Let's do it.
I feel like I feel like this is so new. We don't even know what the pitfalls are yet.
Sure, fair.
Ask us in 2 years.
I mean, I would say that healthcare is slow. It's slow to adopt new software. So running into like sales roadblocks, but let's talk about the opportunities.
Well, it is slow to adopt new software, which is why this AI stuff is so exciting, because it is 10x accelerated compared to any adoption curve that we've seen for software previously.
In healthcare too?
In healthcare too. 100%. Every industry, all the most conservative industries in the world, banking, government, defense, all the industries that are like historically, very difficult to sell to, very long enterprise sales cycles, AI just blew it all open.
So you're saying that this whole time they could have been moving faster, but they have chosen to move slowly. And now they finally have like the internal resources and motivation to adopt new products.
Well, I'm not sure
it's the motivation, I think. They like the ROI calculation is fundamentally 10x better. And so, organizations respond to incentives just like everyone does. I don't know. Ankit, how are you going to add?
Yeah, I was going to add that, I think that I think one way to look at healthcare software adoption is that, it's been really slow over the last few years. And I think that's a fair thing compared to adoption of software in some hyper technical thing like, enterprise software for sales or something like that. But in a sense, healthcare has been transformed by software regularly for the last decade, right? Like today, almost every healthcare interaction in the US is happening in an EHR, and that was not the case a decade ago, for example. Now, I think what's really interesting about AI is that, in a sense, it's solving a lot of what made software adoption really hard in healthcare in the past, right? A big part of what made software adoption really hard in healthcare was interoperability, right? If you had a software tool in some healthcare context, its ability to talk to all the other software tools or non-software tools was extremely difficult in the past because you had this web of things that were talking to each other and you had to have some complicated API structure where they could all talk to each other, and some of them are from 20 years ago and some are recent and so on, and wasn't really a great way for these things to talk. It turns out if you have natural language, whether that's voice-based or text-based, it's an amazing API for things to talk to each other. It's maybe the best API for things to talk to each other. And it makes it actually much easier to sell software in the context of healthcare because you actually don't have as hard of an interoperability problem. If you can have a tool talk to another tool, or a person talk to a tool, or a person talk to another person with software in the middle that can interpret things in natural language, it actually solves one of the hardest problems in kind of healthcare technology. And so I think that's a component of what we're seeing is that it actually isn't just like a desire change. It's actually, there is a technical breakthrough here that opens up new possibilities.
So motivation, we're seeing the ROI is just too high for them to pass up new opportunities. And then the biggest barrier to date of interoperability and just like the switching cost of moving to something new that might not be interoperable has been erased. What else? Are there other, there must be some sort of like, my board wants me to move faster on AI. There must be some, external pressure as well for the buyers, whatever position they're in, just because it's so talked about, the opportunity so talked about it at every level. Whereas perhaps in the past, the board wasn't as savvy about what new technologies were available.
There's certainly some of that for larger enterprises. They have sort of like top-down pressure to like invest in AI. But a lot of our most successful AI healthcare companies in the last couple of years are not selling to large companies that have boards and AI strategies. They're selling to, local clinics and doctors' offices and small companies. They don't care about AI as such. They're just trying to like run their business, and these products solve a problem for them. And I think like the big unlock is, for the first time, AI is not just the system of record for the people doing the work, like an EHR, which is it tracks the work, right? The EHR does not care for your patient. It just tracks the care that that the doctor's already doing. Like for the first time, the software can actually do the work. And there are many exciting areas to apply AI to in healthcare, but I just want to talk about one to make it concrete. Yep. And it's using AI to automate basically all aspects of healthcare that are not caring for patients. At any healthcare organization, there's a lot of people whose jobs are doing stuff that has nothing to do with caring for patients, right? It's like all the organization, all the operations, all the back office stuff, all that is a huge percentage of healthcare spend in the U.S. basically goes to all these back office tasks. Nobody goes into healthcare in order to do back office tasks, right? And AI has an incredible product market fit at being able to streamline that stuff and make it all more efficient.
I've heard jokes about kind of these like AI wars between the provider and the health plan, because now the providers have better tools for filing claims and making the argument that doesn't cost them money or as much money, because you now have a person on the phone with United, which is, part of the plan is making it really difficult. And then on the other side, they're just going to kind of like make it harder to file those claims. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
At some point, it's going to be agents talking to agents on the phone.
Yeah.
And in a sense, that's
kind
agents. Of the best case.
AI agents.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. I think what's kind of funny about that future is, on the one hand, it's sort of hilarious and like a weird future to live in, that we have, we've like retrofitted phone calls and like replace each side with AI agents. And that's sort of a weird path-dependent outcome that we're in. On the other hand, maybe that's actually the correct outcome. Like maybe that's actually a great equilibrium where you have a bunch of pieces of technology that can talk to each other, and they can talk to each other in a way that represents each of their individual incentives, and however they align on an outcome is therefore aligned with each of their individual incentives. And we don't have to build a bunch of complicated software to do that. We can actually just let the AI agents talk to each other and figure it out. That's actually a pretty awesome way to do it.
Yeah, I actually saw that one of the MLB, I don't know, one of the sports teams now is using AI as like the umpire, which is like, that makes so much sense. Like, of course, like they're all these calls that they're making of like what ball is out or in is like, that is subjective. And it's like one person's eye. Certainly games have been swung one way or the other unfairly because of human error. And so I was like, oh, finally, like, I'm not even a sports fan, but I was like, that makes a lot of sense where you can add fairness into a system. What do you guys think is the opportunity for us as healthcare consumers for AI, and how it can transform our experience with the healthcare system and managing our health?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the part that I'm maybe personally most excited about. I think if you think about most people's average interaction with the healthcare system, pretty much the part in which they're talking to their doctor is probably the part they think fondly of most of the time. And pretty much every other part is the part they probably don't think fondly of. And like,
waiting in the waiting room.
Yeah,
the
waiting room,
the bills,
making the appointment, getting the appointment, getting a random bill afterwards, having to fight the bill afterwards, having to wait a whole bunch for 7 different people to talk to you, having some complicated structure you don't fully understand and there's no one to talk to about it. All of these things are pretty lame about the current way we get healthcare. And that's in sort of the richest country in the world with the best medical resources and all that stuff. And I think what we're going to see is that increasingly we'll see what happens in terms of the actual getting care part. I think that's a more complicated part of how AI enters the picture. But putting that part aside, I think we're going to see the rest of the process get significantly better. I think you're going to be able to pick up the phone and someone's going to pick up every single time. And it might not be a person, but you're not going to care because it's actually going to be great. And you'll get an appointment a lot faster. And then afterwards, you'll be able to get someone to explain your bill if you have a bill, or be able to take care of the bill for you. And these are going to be a really amazing set of changes to happen to all of the painful parts of medicine.
Jared, any hopes and dreams you have?
Well, I'm going to wade into the controversial territory, which is like right now, the amount of medical care that the U.S. can provide is limited by the number of trained healthcare professionals who can do that care. And becoming a doctor is very hard. It takes a long time. Not that many people have the aptitude or perseverance required to do it. And so part of the reasons, everyone always talks about how healthcare in how U.S. is expensive. And like part of that has been seemingly intractable for a long time because it's just very expensive to train doctors and train healthcare professionals. What if that constraint went away? What if everyone had a doctor in their pocket? I mean, honestly, the LLMs right now are probably already capable of being quite good doctors, and they are somewhat prevented from being so by effectively regulatory and legal risk concerns from those companies. But over the next few years, it just seems inevitable to me that we are going to work out those constraints, because if the technology is capable of doing it, there's so much market pull for it to be done. And that is going to completely change the cost structure of the healthcare industry.
Yeah, as long as regulatory can keep up. I mean, there's already been studies that have shown that AI is more effective at being a diagnostician than a doctor plus AI or a doctor alone.
Yeah, and it has infinite cycles. I mean, it can spend unlimited amounts of like brain cycles on your case. No doctor can do that, right? Yep. And so even if per minute it's less good than a doctor, having an infinitely patient doctor that's available 24/7 it's just something that would have been inconceivable 2 years ago. I think even I am still digesting like the true consequences of what that's going to mean for the world.
Yeah, I think people are already starting to use different chatbots in this way and seeing how truly helpful it'll be. So if it's not something that's pushed, it'll be pulled by patients as they see. And I think that there's always going to be a need for a human element in healthcare. But certainly, we can no longer deny that AI will be better at helping us diagnose and choose a treatment path than the worst doctor. Might not be as good as the best doctor, but they're definitely better than the worst doctor.
Yeah, certainly.
And I think just to sort of add to that, like going beyond the U.S. context for a second, I think it's almost certainly the case that in the U.S. It's the biggest market and it's where the most money will be made and all that stuff, and that's all great. But there probably exists.
It's not great that it's the biggest market, but yes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. That's maybe a failure. That's maybe a bug, not a feature, perhaps.
Yeah.
But there's probably something like 3 billion people in the world who have essentially no access to like a great medical professional available to them.
Absolutely.
And it seems like now you can probably get access to that for something like $20 a month, which is a sort of outrageous change in the financial calculus for what this could look like. We're talking about, what even the governments of the poorest countries in the world will be able to fund access to medical knowledge for basically everyone for basically free. And that's sort of absurd change to kind of humanity's possibilities. And how exactly that'll get rolled out and how people will use it is very much TBD, and that's what we hope founders will help build with us. But I think it's
incredible to think
a
about.
Wild new possibility. Totally crazy.
Well, last question for you guys, and I like to ask all my guests this. If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about our healthcare system, what would it be?
Good question.
Go ahead,
That's a hard one. That's a hard one.
Oh, you laughed like you had something. Something devious.
There's so much to change.
Yeah. Do you get a chance to change one thing?
I mean, this is not a thing that I think Well, actually, maybe something that AI can help with. But, I think there's a crazy number of people in our healthcare system that are there because they're never getting access to primary care. Like, essentially, they are not able to access a primary care physician. And as a result, they go untreated for decades. And then as a result, they end up with some like horrible situation they're in. And then you're kind of stuck. And if we could actually figure out a way to get universal primary care to everyone in the world, I think that would be amazing. I think that would probably solve most medical problems, to just get universal primary care to everyone. And I'm not sure if that's an AI thing or what. I guess we'll see how it all rolls out. But
you have a magic wand, so that it's your magic wand solution. There you go.
Seems like universal knowledge would be helpful for that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, primary care is the only specialty that has been shown that the more primary care physicians there are, the more money we save and the longer people live.
Yeah, checks out.
All right, I have one for you.
Great.
I wish we could roll back some of the patient privacy rules. I understand why they were created. People are very sensitive about their healthcare data. But the fact is, there is no way to get a bird's eye view of all the healthcare data of all Americans because of these patient privacy rules. If you go to a system like UK, which is one unified system, all the patient records basically sit in one EHR, and you can do population health studies across all of them. That doesn't exist in America. And these data privacy laws that were designed to help and protect Americans, they were certainly well intentioned, but the unintended consequence of it is it is extremely difficult to do any sort of digital processing with healthcare information, which ultimately has the effect of making the actual product of healthcare much more expensive and much worse for everyone. And I think the people who wrote those laws didn't fully understand the second and third order consequences of creating all this regulatory tape around privacy. And I think there is a way that you could rewrite those laws that would totally protect against, these privacy edge cases that people were originally worried about, while basically allowing software companies and AI to do what they're good at, which is like process information.
Amazing. All right.
Yeah,
well,
I think actually,
Jared, that was a good one. It took you a minute, but that was a good one.
Well, one related anecdote to that actually is, I don't know, actually, Jared, if you've seen some of the recent changes with the UK biobank, the one you cite actually, but actually it seems like the UK is kind of going in a similar direction as the US in terms of making it harder to access that data. So today, if you want to actually access the UK biobank, you have to go through a specific web portal in which there's a specific machine in which you can run specific sets of jobs. You cannot actually, spin up an AWS account and set up, kind of modern infrastructure and do anything interesting. That you have to go through this one web interface to do it, which, anyone who's done any data science knows is going to be extremely restrictive. So even in the UK's case is a striking thing where they actually built this amazing data set that I think has already produced amazing value in the last several years and are sort of now limiting it post facto with some of these privacy restrictions in mind, and probably not the right move for patient health ultimately.
Well, I'll close by saying something I heard once that stuck with me, and it was, we don't have big data in healthcare. We have lots of little data in healthcare. So, all right, guys, thank you so much for being here today. It was fun chatting with you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having us.